I was sent to the Demon Lord's inner sanctum with one goal: to help him stabilize his decaying realm through a forbidden blood pact. As an Omega subject, I knew the risks of proximity to an unbound Alpha, but we promised to keep our cooperation strictly professional. That promise shattered the moment the ritual triggered a biological fated bond neither of us saw coming. Now, I'm carrying the heir to a throne that wants us both dead, and my partner is ready to burn the world down to keep us safe.
Welcome to another Bliss Tales video. Subscribe to my channel to keep these beautiful tales alive. New info, we have memberships and supers now where you can thank me and suggest new video ideas. Thanks for your support.
In the Dark Shadow Realm, some histories are buried beneath the Kingdom Scrolls. Not because they're forgotten, but because the ones who lived them learned quickly that remembering is dangerous. This is one of those stories, and I need you to understand something before we go any further. What I'm about to tell you isn't a love story. Not the kind they sing about in the upper courts, anyway. It's not soft. It's not simple. It's the kind of thing that starts with duty and ends with a man choosing his heart over his crown, and the entire world paying attention when he does. But we're not there yet. We have to start at the beginning, at the part where everything still looked manageable. Visego was not supposed to matter. That's the thing about the people who change history. They rarely look like they're going to. Visego arrived at the gates of the Shadow Citadel on a gray morning, carrying nothing but a sealed case of calibration instruments and a letter of authorization stamped with the High Council's crest. He was 26. He was slim, dark-haired, quiet in the way that reads as unremarkable until you actually listen to him. He had the kind of eyes that took in a room all at once and said nothing about what they'd seen. He was a logistical strategist, first class, the Council's best, sent to assist Lord Malphas, the ruler, the unbound Alpha, the living storm at the center of the realm, with something they were calling a semantic calibration, a merging of magical signatures, a stabilization process for a realm that was, quietly and then not so quietly, beginning to come apart at its seams. Visego knew what he was walking into. He'd read every classified report on the Shadow Citadel. He knew the political layout, the structural decay, the leakage points in the dimensional boundary. He knew the theory behind the ritual. He knew the risks. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known because no report ever mentions the things that happen inside a person's chest, was what it would feel like to stand in the same room as Lord Malphas for the first time. And Malphas, God, where do you even start with Malphas? He was tall in a way that wasn't just physical. He filled a room differently than other men did. He had this stillness about him, this absolute practiced stillness, that should have read as calm but actually read as something more like a suppressed catastrophe. Like a thunderstorm that had decided, for now, not to rain. He was dark-skinned, sharp-featured, dressed in blacks and deep violets that caught the light of the Citadel's dim chandeliers. His eyes were gold. Not warm gold, cold gold. The kind that watches and measures and decides. He looked at Visego the way a general looks at a supply order. Useful. Temporary. Already categorized. You're the strategist, he said. Not a question. Yes, my lord. You understand the terms of the calibration? I do. Then you understand you are here in a professional capacity only. You eat when scheduled. You sleep in the East Wing. You do not enter the throne room without an escort. And you do not, he said, ask questions about things that aren't your concern. Visego held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Understood, he said, and that was how it began. Clean. Transactional. 2 people with a job to do and a very clear agreement about what this was and what it wasn't. You can probably already feel it, can't you? That particular tension of watching 2 people try very hard to be professional about something that is already, somewhere under the surface, not going to stay professional. But we're not there yet. The calibration sessions were intense in ways that had nothing to do with attraction. At least not at first. They worked in the ritual chamber every evening. It was a circular room carved from black obsidian, lit by floating blue flames, with a central platform where they would sit across from each other, close enough to make the energy transfer efficient, far enough that Malthus could pretend he wasn't aware of every breath Visego took. The process required them to open their magical channels simultaneously, to let their energy signatures brush against each other, calibrate, synchronize. It was supposed to feel like tuning two instruments to the same frequency. Clinical, methodical. It did not feel clinical. The first session, Visego felt it the moment their channels opened. This pull. Not aggressive, not obvious. More like a tide. Like something deep in the current of his own energy recognizing something in Malthus's and leaning toward it without permission. He controlled it, filed it under resonance artifact in his head and moved on. Malthus, across from him, didn't react at all. His eyes stayed closed. His breathing stayed even. If he felt anything, he chose not to show it. That became the pattern. Every evening. Come in. Sit down. Open the channels. Work. Close the channels. Separate. But every session, the pull got a little stronger. And the silences in between got a little heavier. They started talking. Small things at first. Technical things. Malthus asking about Visego's methodology. Visego asking about the realm's structural history. But then, and this happened so gradually that neither of them could have told you exactly when it changed, the conversation started bleeding past the technical. Malthus told him once, late in the second week, about the first time he'd felt the realm shudder beneath him. He'd been barely 18. His father had just died. The power of the darkness had transferred into him like a flood into a cup that wasn't big enough yet. And he'd stood in the throne room alone and felt the entire dimension shaking and understood for the first time that he was now the only thing holding it together. He told Visego this like he was reporting a meteorological event. Flat. Factual. But his hands were resting on his knees, and his left hand had curled into a fist without him seeming to notice. Visego noticed. He didn't say anything about it. He just said, quietly, "That sounds like a very heavy thing to carry at 18. And Malthus looked at him. Not the measuring look he usually used. Something else. Just for a second. Like he'd been unexpectedly handed something he didn't know he was waiting for. Then it was gone. The mask came back down. He said something dismissive about resilience and necessity and they went back to work. But Visego kept thinking about that look. He kept thinking about it more than was professional. The collapse happened on a Thursday. That's the thing about catastrophic events. They so rarely announce themselves. They just arrive midweek, casual as anything, and change the shape of everything. They were 9 days into the calibration when the realm's boundary cracked. Not metaphorically. The dimensional wall in the northern sector literally fractured. A sound like the world clearing its throat, followed by a drop in atmospheric pressure that Visego felt in his teeth. The blue flames in the chamber went out. The obsidian walls started bleeding silver light where they shouldn't have been. Malthus was on his feet instantly. So was Visego. Their eyes met across the platform. "We have to tether," Malthus said. His voice was controlled but tight. "Now. Physical contact tethering. The energy signature needs a physical anchor or the calibration loses the last 2 weeks entirely." Visego understood immediately. He also understood what physical tethering meant. Their energy channels had to fuse, not just brush against each other, but fully, completely fuse. And you don't do that from opposite ends of a platform. "How close?" Visego asked. Malthus crossed the platform in 4 steps, stopping directly in front of him. This close, Visego could see the controlled chaos in those gold eyes. Could feel the heat coming off him. The gravity of him. "This close," Malthus said. And then he put his hands on Visego's face. Not gently, not tenderly, the grip of a man trying to save something, and opened his channel fully. The world went white. Not blank. White. Like light. Like sound. Like every wall between two people dissolving at once and suddenly you are standing in the full force of someone else's interior. Their grief, their exhaustion, their loneliness worn smooth by years of refusing to name it, and they are standing in yours. Visego gasped. Malthus made a sound like the word no halfway through becoming something else. And then neither of them was thinking about the realm or the calibration or the high council or duty or protocol, because the resonance had finally, completely arrived. The thing they'd been circling for 9 days without admitting it. The biological inevitability of an unbound alpha in sustained proximity to an omega whose own nature had been carefully hidden, carefully contained, carefully never mentioned in any file or report or authorization letter. The tethering worked. The boundary stabilized. They stayed like that, hands on skin, channels fully open, the realm humming back into equilibrium around them, for longer than necessary. Neither of them moved first. When they finally separated, the physical distance felt wrong in a way it hadn't before. Like a gap that hadn't existed yesterday. Malthus stepped back. His composure was back up, but it was doing the work now. You could see it working. The boundary is stable, he said. Yes, Vasego said. A long silence. This doesn't change the terms of our arrangement, Malthus said. Vasego looked at him for a moment. Of course not, he said. They both knew they were lying. What happened next happened slowly and then all at once, the way things do when two people are pretending very hard not to want what they already want. The calibration continued. But now, after the sessions, they didn't separate immediately. They sat in the dim chamber and talked. Actually talked. Malthus showed Vasego the cartography of the realm, the old maps, the ones from before his father's rule, before the hierarchy had calcified into something cold and rigid. He talked about what the dark shadow realm had been meant to be originally. Not a dominion of fear, a place of complexity, of shadow and depth and necessary darkness, the kind that lets things grow. Vasego listened the way people only listen when they're falling in love, which is to say, completely. And Malthus, watching him listen, felt something in his chest that he couldn't name and wouldn't allow himself to name. So he just kept talking. One night, 3 weeks in, the realm steady and both of them pretending that steadiness was the only thing between them. Malthus came to Vasego's quarters in the east wing. It was past midnight. He didn't knock for very long. He stood in the doorway with that particular expression of a man who has argued himself out of something 17 times and shown up anyway. Vasego looked at him, didn't say anything, just stepped back from the door. And Malthus came in. What happened that night was not a surprise to either of them. It was the arrival of something that had been building since the first session in the obsidian chamber. Every deflected glance, every professional withdrawal, every careful maintenance of appropriate distance. It had all been water behind a dam, and now the dam was just gone. Malthus was not gentle about it, but he was careful. There's a difference, and Vasego felt it in every moment. The alpha nature of him fully present, fully unbound, but aimed entirely at Vasego's safety and pleasure rather than dominance. His hands shook once. Just once. Vasego noticed and said nothing, just pulled him closer, and felt Malthus exhale like a man who has been holding his breath for a very long time. The bond completed itself somewhere in the deepest hours of that night. Neither of them saw it happen exactly. It was more like waking up inside something that had already decided. In the morning, Malthus lay on his back staring at the ceiling of the east wing with an expression that Vasego, watching him from the other pillow, could only describe as a man doing mathematics he doesn't like the answer to. Say it, Vasego said quietly. This complicates things. It does. I don't know how to. He stopped. I know. Malthus turned his head and looked at him. Gold eyes in the early dark. Something in them that had no armor on it anymore. I'm not good at this, he said. I know that too, Vasego said. Neither am I. A beat. We'll figure it out, Vasego said. Malthus looked at him for a long moment. And then, because he was not yet brave enough for words, he simply reached over and took Vasego's hand. 6 weeks. That's how long they had before the world started noticing. 6 weeks of calibration sessions that ran long. Of meals eaten together in the private dining room that no one had used since Malthus's mother died. Of Malthus showing Vasego the Citadel's hidden library. The one behind the throne room, full of books the High Council didn't know existed. Of falling asleep in the same bed and waking up tangled together and pretending very poorly that this was somehow still professional. 6 weeks before Vasego noticed the exhaustion, the nausea in the mornings, the particular sensitivity in his body that had nothing to do with the calibration. He knew what it was immediately. He'd known it was theoretically possible from the moment the bond completed. He'd simply not thought about it, because thinking about it would have required thinking about what it meant. And what it meant was too large to look at directly. He sat in the East Wing bathroom for an hour before he told Malphas. Then he went and told him. He didn't soften it. He just said, "I'm pregnant." Malphas went very still. That particular stillness of his, the suppressed catastrophe one. Except this time Vasego could see through it, could feel through the bond exactly what was happening on the other side of that stillness. It wasn't rejection. It was terror. The specific terror of a man who has just understood the size of what he stands to lose. "The Council's law," Malphas said very quietly. "I know," Vasego said. In the Dark Shadow Realm, an Omega pregnancy bound to an Alpha ruler was not an impossibility, it was a classified event. And the law around it was ancient and very clear. An heir born of a subject, an outsider, a non-blood pure Omega, was designated a genetic anomaly. An aberration in the bloodline. The law required the council to purge the anomaly. The law required the Lord to comply. The law required Malphas to choose the throne over Vasego. Neither of them said that part out loud. Malphas stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there for a long time looking out at the Shadow Realm, this dimension he had held together since he was 18 years old, and Vasego watched his back and waited. When Malphas turned around, his face had done something new. It had closed, but differently than before. Before, the mask had been to keep people out. This was different. This was armor for a specific battle. "No one outside this room knows," he said. "No. We keep it that way." He crossed the room and took Vasego's face in his hands again. "Like the tethering, but tender this time. We have time. And I am going to use every hour of it." The next month was both the best and worst of Vasego's life. The best because Malphas, who had been carefully cold for as long as anyone in the realm had known him, did not know how to do love halfway now that he'd started. He brought Vasego rare texts from the hidden library because he'd mentioned a historical interest once and Malphas had filed it away and acted on it 3 weeks later. He sat on the floor of the East Wing at midnight with his head leaning against Vasego's knee while they talked about nothing important. He learned, slowly and visibly, to touch without a reason, to say things plainly. He was clumsy at it sometimes. He said the right thing in the wrong tone. He offered protection when what was needed was presence. But he kept trying. And there is nothing quite like watching someone keep trying. Vasego loved him in the way you love something that is both more and less than you expected, which is the most honest way there is. The worst because they were hiding. They were fugitives in a palace. Every council meeting Malphas attended alone, coming back tighter wound than when he left. Every servant who looked too long. Every report that came in about unusual energy readings from the East Wing. The walls had ears in the Shadow Citadel and they both knew it. Vasego's condition was, so far, concealable. Barely. The magical signature of the pregnancy. What the old texts called a void heir. A child born of both darkness and the pure energy of an Omega bond. Was unlike anything in the Council's detection records. It read as ambient ritual energy. For now. Malphas told him one evening, quietly, over a dinner neither of them were eating. "I've been looking for a precedent. Something in the old law that might. And," a pause, "there are older laws. Pre-council laws. Before the hierarchy was codified. In those texts, an Omega who carries a Lord's heir is not property of the state. The heir is not an anomaly. The heir is..." He stopped. "What?" "Proof of a complete bond," Malphas said. "In the old law, that's the highest form of governance confirmation. A lord whose soul had completed a full bond was considered more stable, more powerful. They buried it," Vasego said. "They buried it. And there it was. The thing underneath the thing. The real reason the council's law was the way it was. Not purity. Not bloodline protection. Control. The kind of control that requires its leaders to be alone. To have nothing they love too much to risk. To be, at the end of every day, answerable only to the institution. A lord with a completed bond. A lord with a mate. A lord with a child. Is a lord who might one day say no. That was what they were really afraid of. The council found out on a Tuesday. Again with the Tuesdays. Again with the casual arrivals. A routine inspection of the ritual chamber's energy logs. A council archivist who was more thorough than expected. A magical signature that had finally grown too specific to read as anything other than what it was. 3 High Council members appeared in the Citadel without announcement at noon, while Malphas was in a boundary review meeting and Visego was in the library. Visego heard them before he saw them. Voices in the corridor. The particular cadence of men who are certain of their authority. He was already on his feet when Malphas came through the library door first. He'd left the meeting the moment the council's arrival was announced, which was a thing that Malphas in any previous chapter of his life would not have done. The 3 council members filled the doorway behind him. Lord Malphas, the eldest said. His name was Vareth. He was old and precise and had been running the High Council for 40 years by being very good at identifying what needed to be removed. We have reviewed the chamber logs. Malphas said nothing. The Omega subject, Vareth said, looking past Malphas to where Visego stood among the bookshelves, is carrying a void signature heir. The law is clear. The law, Malphas said, is what I say it is. Pause in the room. Even Visego felt it. The law, Vareth said carefully, predates your rule, my lord, and exists independent of any individual's preferences. The word landed like something pointed. Malphas turned to face the council fully. He was not performing calm anymore. He was just still. Completely, terribly still. You will leave this library, he said. You will return to the council chambers. And you will wait there while I consider my response. Vareth assessed him for a long moment. My lord, the law does not. Leave. They left. Visego let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Malphas turned around. His eyes found Visego across the library. And the thing about Malphas in that moment, the thing that Visego would think about for the rest of his life, was that there was no conflict in his face. No deliberation. No weighing of options. Whatever decision he'd made, he'd already made it. Completely. At some point that wasn't this moment. Maybe it was the moment Visego had said, I'm pregnant. Maybe it was earlier. Maybe it was the night in the East Wing when he'd reached across the dark and taken his hand. Come here, Malphas said. Visego crossed the library. Malphas pulled him in and held him with the kind of grip that isn't about comfort. It's about certainty. About one person saying to another, this is the thing that is real. Everything else is negotiable. What are you going to do? Visego said into his shoulder. What I should have done a long time ago, Malphas said. They came to the throne room together. The entire council was assembled. 12 members in their black robes, arranged in a semicircle before the throne. The room was vast and cold and designed specifically to make individuals feel small. It was very good at its job. Malphas walked in like he owned it. Because he did. Because he always had. That hadn't changed. What had changed was who he was walking beside. Visego to his right. Not behind him. Not at a respectful distance. Right there. The council saw it immediately. Vareth spoke first. Of course he did. Lord Malphas. The law requires. I know what the law requires, Malphas said. His voice carried the entire room without effort. The way it always did. I also know that the law was written by men who were afraid. A ripple through the council. The decay of this realm, Malphas continued, which you have been trying to solve through stabilization protocols and energy restructuring for the past decade. Do you want to know what was actually causing it? Silence. The absence of a complete bond, he said. There are texts in the Citadel's own library, pre-council texts, your texts, that document this explicitly. A lord unbound is a lord whose power has no anchor. His energy leaks. The realm reflects him. He paused. It reflected me for years. I was a ruler with nothing to protect except the office itself. And a throne that protects only itself will rot. Varitha's face had gone very careful. My lord, whatever you believe about ancient texts, the current law, I am abdicating. The room stopped. Even Visego, who had suspected, felt the word land in his chest with the weight of something enormous. I am abdicating the throne of the dark shadow realm, Malphas said, and dissolving my binding to the sovereignty object. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small obsidian key. The sovereignty cipher, the physical token of his rule, something that had existed in the Malphas line for 200 years. The realm's energy is now self-stabilized. The calibration worked. The dimension no longer requires an unbound alpha to anchor it, because the anchor isn't the alpha. It never was. It was always the bond. He placed the sovereignty cipher on the arm of the throne. Then he looked at Varith. The law you are trying to enforce was written to keep lords alone, he said. To ensure that the man on the throne has no one he'd choose over the throne. That's not governance. That's a leash. He glanced back at Visego. I choose him. I choose my son. And I will not be the kind of man who requires a law to tell him which one matters. He walked away from the throne. He walked to Visego. The council did not move. Not because they had decided to allow it, but because Malphas had, in the space of 3 minutes, removed the entire premise of their authority over him. You cannot enforce the law of the Lord's conduct on a man who is no longer the Lord. You cannot demand the purging of an heir from a man who has already handed back the office that made the heir's existence illegal. They had prepared for resistance. They had not prepared for abdication. Malphas stopped in front of Visego. Close. The gold eyes, now with something soft in them that had been there for weeks but was usually behind layers of control. I told you I wasn't good at this, he said quietly. You're getting better, Visego said. And somewhere in the citadel, in the walls and the floors and the deep dimensional fabric of the dark shadow realm, something shifted. Like a house that has been slightly off its foundation for years finally settling into level ground. The silver light that had been bleeding through the obsidian walls for as long as anyone could remember simply stopped. The realm breathed. They left the citadel that evening. Not dramatically. Not like refugees. Malphas arranged it with the same logistical precision he had applied to everything else for his entire life. Except this time the thing he was organizing was a life rather than a realm. Quarters in the old district of the Shadow City. Below the citadel's reach. Books from the hidden library. Visego's instruments. A very specific collection of maps. The High Council spent 3 weeks in emergency sessions determining what to do about a shadow realm without a lord. They eventually appointed a governance committee, which was, in Visego's private opinion, probably better for everyone. Malphas never went back to the throne room. He did, about 4 months later, go back to the obsidian chamber with Visego once. Just to see it. They stood in the dim room with its floating blue flames and the central platform where they'd sat across from each other every evening pretending to be strangers, and Visego looked at the platform and felt the whole geography of the last year in his body all at once. We were so careful, he said. We were ridiculous, Malphas said. Visego laughed. Actually laughed. It echoed in the obsidian room and startled them both. Malphas looked at him with that expression he had now. The one that had stopped being rare, the one that had been getting more frequent since the library, since the throne room, since the night in the East Wing a year ago that had changed the shape of everything. He put his hand on Visego's face. Not like the tethering. Not urgent or desperate. Just here. Present. Chosen. I would do it again, Malphas said. All of it. From the beginning. Visego held his gaze. Even the part where you treated me like a supply order for the first week? I was managing my reaction. Terribly. I know. Visego leaned his forehead against Malphas's shoulder. Malphas put his arms around him. one hand resting with a kind of reverence on the curve of Visego's side where their sun was growing quietly, all void energy and becoming. They stood like that in the obsidian chamber with the blue flames reflecting off the walls. Not rulers, not functionaries, not a lord and his subject. Just two men at the beginning of a life they'd chosen, standing in the room where it started. The realm hummed around them, steady, level, finally at rest. They say, in the histories the council eventually rewrote, and in the older stories that never got rewritten because they'd been buried too long to find, that the void heir was born on a night when the entire shadow realm lit up from inside. Not silver, not the color of decay, but deep gold. Malphas's gold. They say the child was born with both darkness and light in his eyes, which is impossible and also exactly what happened. They say Malphas, former lord, former unbound alpha, man who had once run a dimension on pure cold isolation, sat on the floor of a room above a shadow city with his son in his arms and cried. Not dramatically, just quietly. The way you cry when something happens that you're not sure you deserved and you're not willing to look away from for even a second because you want to make sure it's real. Visego, exhausted and whole in the way you only are on the other side of something enormous, watched him. He thought, this is what power actually looks like. Not a throne, not a title. A man who burned down his own authority because the alternative was unthinkable. And I really do think that this is the part of the story that doesn't get told enough. Not the grand gesture, not the abdication in front of the council, dramatic as it was, but this, the floor, the quiet room, the small person in large hands, the entirely ordinary miracle of a love that refused to be categorized and an heir that the world called an anomaly and two men who called him theirs. The realm had been decaying for years because it was being held together by isolation and duty and the belief that power requires you to have nothing to protect except the power itself. They stabilized it. Not with instruments. Not with blood packs or semantic calibrations or energy signatures. With a bond. With the terrifying, irreversible, world-reordering decision to simply refuse to choose the throne over the person. That's the story they don't tell in the dark shadow realm. And now you know it.
If you loved this video, show me some support by subscribing and clicking the notification bell.